Okay, well, let's get started. I believe in rewarding everybody who gets on here early and who comes on time. So let me introduce myself. I am Ashley Ross, and I am one of the partners and founders of the Coaching Chicks. Cindy Bishop and I formed this organization a couple years ago in order to help real estate agents learn how to become better at sales, better at closing sales, and how to make more leads. So this is part of our 3 times a month webinar, and this is actually a special one, so we're doing 4 this month. And I am so happy to introduce Barry Robinson, who is here with us from CSI Home and Commercial Services, and he's one of our regular instructors who helps us with, oh my gosh, so many different topics, but today the topic is mold. It's a growing problem, and anybody who knows me knows that I have absolutely no phobias except for mold. I can handle snakes, I can handle spiders, I can handle, heights. I cannot handle mold. So, Barry, I want to say thank you so much, and I'll provide some information at the end as to how you can contact him with more questions. So, Barry, I'm turning it over to you. It's all yours.
Just mold, that's your only phobia, huh, Ashley? Well, I'll try to be gentle and not scare you too much during this presentation.
I appreciate that, Barry.
We're going to talk about the growing problem. And when you talk about mold, all of a sudden, for several years ago, the big word in home inspections and concern was the L word, or lead paint. Now it's the M word, or mold. And you got to ask yourself why all of a sudden is mold a bigger problem. Interestingly enough, if you go back in the Bible in Leviticus, it talks about mold, and it says that if you had mold on your home, that you should clean the stones of the home and have a priest bless it. And if the mold comes back, disassemble the home and take it to an unclean place. I guess that was their early landfills or something. So it's not really something that just was created. Mold has a purpose in helping break down leaf litter and fallen timbers. The problem is we build our homes out of the same thing. And the reason it's a bigger problem now is because back in the 70s, when the energy situation started, we started trying to make our homes more airtight. And those new construction codes included tie-vac, air barriers. And basically those buildings became less ventilated and not able to breathe as well. And that kind of suited mold growth a little better. Also, the type of material now is the trees are grown fast, fertilized heavy, cut down earth, accounts for some nail pops as the wood sometimes doesn't dry till it gets into the house completely. Whereas before we used more of the heart lumber in some of the older homes. So that's one of the reasons we see a lot more of it now. And when it comes down to the actual element that causes a mold growth problem, which are the mold spores, they're everywhere. Wherever you are right now, with the exception of a few hospital clean rooms, there's mold spores in the room you're in. And what they're looking for, and if you could look at them kind of like seeds looking for some place to germinate, they float through the air and look for an area to land that has moisture, organic food source. And if they find that, they germinate. If you're growing grass, you got to have contact and water. In the mold world, they got to have moisture, water as well, and an organic food source. When they get that, they land, start growing, and become a problem. And the total 4 requirements for the successful growth of that spore once it germinates, and that mold growth, is the spore itself, the food we talked about, an organic food source, and then proper temperature. And finally, they have to have some source of moisture, whether it be humidity or a leak, moisture from a leak, plumbing leak, roof leak, or water intrusion in a basement. And the mold spores themselves, if we start talking about, okay, we got these, but what can we do to keep growth from happening? The first element is mold spores. And as you can see from this schematic here, mold spores are very small. I mean, you compare them to human hair, they're real tiny. So they're not something you're going to see. And whether you realize it or not, when you come inside from outdoors, you got mold spores on your clothes, on your shoes, and you'll actually bring them into the environment that you're in. So trying to control mold growth by preventing or keeping spores out of the property is a little complicated. Thing is mold food. And, you all had them mold on food products. Here you see an indication of where it doesn't take a whole lot of food. The grease on a fingerprint got some mold growing on it. Surface mold when you got humidity on paneling or something. And then books, cheeses, foods. There's a lot of things that mold can use as food. And most of our homes are built out of a lot of wood or wood byproducts that they use as food. So trying to eliminate mold by cutting off the food, that's not going to work either. So let's talk about temperature. A lot of times we try to preserve our food and keep mold from growing by keeping it in the refrigerator. That does slow down the process. Of course, sometimes, as you can see that by that middle picture, we leave too long and the mold gets the food anyhow. Sometimes us. And so those they survive in similar to the same temperatures that we live in and that are present inside our homes. So once again, it's going to be complicated to control that mold growth by the control of temperature. So the fourth item, humidity or moisture, is the areas that we may have some success in controlling mold growth. And the mold humidity level is generally 55%. And if you get that 55% humidity level, you will end up with those mold spores that they need. You'll affect the surface where they land. If it's an organic source of food, particularly if it's porous cellulose, gotten wet or had that condensation from the humidity, then you've got the growth necessary. So of the four elements that we have a shot of controlling, the humidity or the moisture, either through leaks, plumbing or roof, or water intrusion in the basement, is an area that we could have more success in controlling mold growth. Any time you've had, and in different parts of the country, you have different types of construction. In our area here in Northern Virginia, we have a lot of basement homes. And, we laugh. In a basement home, you think it's not a question of if you're ever going to have a leak, but it's more like when. But if water comes into the basement or either through a leak or plumbing leak, we've always been told, man, you got to clean it up. You got to dry that carpet. You got to do it fast. And the reason is that those mold spores take as little as 24 to 48 hours to grow. And once they start growing, those spores land, grow, and they'll start producing spores of their own. And this growth, if it's visual and we touch it, it can be a problem if we ingest it, or if we breathe those spores that they're now producing inside, they can become a health issue there as well. Fortunately, unlike radon and some other problems that we face in the home, a lot of molds will have a musty or earthy smell, and that'll alert us to a potential problem for their presence and health issues. Anytime anybody talks about mold, I'll ask people, what kind of mold you got? Oh, I got the black mold. Everybody's got the black mold. When it comes down to it, color really doesn't identify a mold as whether it's toxic or not. There are a number of toxic molds, but color alone, you can't identify a mold that way. If you could, you just walk in and say, oh, well, you got the green mold, that's okay, or you got the black mold, we need to do something about that, or you need to get out of the house, and you would eliminate the whole necessity of testing. So before you draw any conclusions based on color or anything, you should have a professional test and send it to a certified lab so you know that the mold you're dealing with is toxic. And that's the best way to tell, because when you get into molds, you got hundreds of thousands of species of mold that have been classified and identified by mycologists, but there's only a small amount of those that are toxic in the overall scheme of the total molds, and just 100 species typically of toxic mold. So it's important to test and know what you're dealing with and make sure it is a potential problem health-wise. When you get into the toxic molds, you have certain molds that are typically toxic, and they can be toxic in different ways. But the most toxic mold, and typically the mold that they sometimes identified as a black mold, is the Stachybotrys. And actually, that mold is a very wet, slimy mold, and it's usually more charcoal gray than it is black. But again, you can't tell by color all the time, so the testing's important. And then you have some other lovely sounding molds like Cladosporium, Fusarium, Penicillium. We've thought and heard about that because it's used in some health cares or antibiotics. And of course, Aspergillus. We think about mold, sometimes if we, leave food out too long or don't refrigerate it properly, we can get this mold growing inside the home on some of the food or food products. I eat it. And some people say, oh, yeah, you can cut off the moldy part and it's fine. A lot of times people don't realize, particularly if you're dealing with bread or bread products, is that mold has what are called hyphae or roots that go deep into the bread or the fruit product itself. So even if you're cutting off the visual part, you still can easily be ingesting mold. So it's not really safe to, do that if you have in the past. So that's kind of the science behind mold, and there are times that it's recommended that you should inspect and test. And we're going to take a little time to talk about those, and then we'll go on to remediate some of the other processes that a realtor may get involved. Should we test or inspect and test for mold? Usually mold, and I talk about it as a symptom, not a problem. People talk about mold problems. It's typically a symptom, and the problem is that there's been some type of water intrusion or condition that created humidity, an event, so to speak, that caused that mold spore that we said was floating around in the air looking for some place to germinate. Gave them the opportunity to do that. And that might have been a severe storm, a construction defect. If you don't have proper filtration in your HVAC system, dirt and dust can build up in the dirt wells, and if they get moisture, mold can grow in the ducts. Plumbing problems, of course, leaks, condensation. Improper insulation will create difference in temperatures that can cause an area to sweat, very similar to the fogging of your windshield in your car. Any water intrusion into basements. Of course, roof or ceiling leaks. And then any items that may linger that got wet by water and aren't cleaned up, mold can grow on them as well. So if you have these events, then it's a good idea to certainly consider and or testing to determine whether or not you have other issues or problems with mold. Health issues may lead you to test for mold. We get a lot of requests when the doctor's been seeing somebody and they have not been able to reach any conclusion on what could be causing their health problem. So they may send them to us to have an indoor air quality test done to see if there's anything in the air that could cause any of these list of physical sensitivities that you see here. Most of them are related to breathing and irritations of the sensitive areas, eyes, runny nose, musty odor sensitivity, sneezing, coughing, headache, brains, breathing, of course, fatigue from lack of oxygen. So again, if you've had them coupled with some type of event that might have caused water intrusion, then it's probably going to be a good idea to inspect and test for mold. So, why do we inspect? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Mold can be hidden. So, you may have hidden mold that you can't physically see. And we'll talk about some areas here shortly where you might commonly have hidden molds. And you want to avoid any unforeseen health risk. And health risk as far as yourself and, the healthy state of your home. There's a building defect problem. You certainly want to correct that, because not only can you avoid the future expense of the repairs, but of course the expense of the remediation process itself. And when you get into the real estate world, the last thing you want is a buyer coming through your home smelling a musty odor and saying, "Oh my goodness, I can't move in here because you probably got mold." So it's a good idea if you have any of those concerns or issues that we talked about, particularly if you're looking to list your property, that you have it tested prior to identify and alleviate any type of mold or elevated mold level. So, where are these problems going to show up? Again, when we talk about mold, the two areas that typically you're going to have issues from moisture or humidity or leaks. So, if you're looking in a bathroom area, that's an area of moisture. So that's a good spot to have an issue with moisture. Some of it may be like, the grouting on the tile or the shower or bathtub. Sometimes if you have pipes that are leaking or sweating underneath the bathroom cabinets, like you see in the middle picture there, that elevated moisture with those cabinet doors shut will actually cause mold, the humidity level to get high, and mold to grow on the vertical walls where there's not a leak or anything, but the level of moisture is the humidity and allow mold to grow in those areas. And, sometimes areas that are, difficult to get to, you might see, tiny leaks from the supply lines and everything in the bathroom areas. Kitchen area, again, you got an area that's a source of moisture. Some of the mold you see here, particularly on the outside of the cabinets, is typically, when you see on the front of cabinets like that, or inside cabinets on vertical surfaces, a lot of times it's from elevated humidity. Sometimes rooms or houses are shut up when they're vacant. The doors and the closets and the cabinets and everything are shut up. And that creates a perfect environment sometimes for poorly ventilated areas to create elevated humidity, and those mold spores, again, looking for that opportunity, will land in those areas, germinate, start to grow, and by the time you see the type of growth that we're seeing here, putting off their own spores or seeds, and that's what creates the musty odor and the potential health hazard for you breathing those. The other areas is in the attic, sometimes because of roof leaks. These upper two pictures are actually due to poor ventilation. And if you think about, again, the difference in temperature when you get in your car on your windshield and your windshield fogs up, the same thing happens between the attic and the outside, where that difference in temperature, condensation will form on the underside of the attic sheathing, and that attic sheathing then will allow moisture, humidity to reach that level of 55% or greater, those mold spores to land. The wood is a food source. They germinate, grow, and start feeding, that activity in that situation, and it can actually, particularly if you have ductwork up there, raise the level of spores in that environment and cause a health hazard to enter the home through the ductwork, even though it's outside the living space. Basements, crawl space, a lot of times because water can intrude in them because they're below grade in basements. Crawl spaces, a lot goes on down there because, nobody goes in and checks them on a regular basis. I have to hire inspectors from time to time, and every once in a while one of them will say, I guess to impress me, they like crawl spaces. And I'm hesitant to hire them because they can't be in their right mind if they like going in a crawl space. So they don't get visited very often, and sometimes humidity or plumbing leaks can cause a mold problem to grow. And again, like in that bottom right-hand picture, if you got ductwork in there, no ductwork is perfectly sealed. So it'll pick up that mold spores that are growing in that crawl space and throw it into your living space, into your breathing zone. Laundry areas, of course. Again, any area with moisture. The themes that are always constant with the mold problems are moisture and humidity. Around your AC units, condensation drain lines, vents not properly sealed can cause difference in temperatures and condensation and mold growth around register vents. Of course, carpet rugs, I laugh. You know, we talked about earlier about basements always leaking. And what do we do in the basement? You know, because we know it's going to leak. Well, we put a sponge down to soak up that water. The carpet padding in a basement area, particularly around an exit door, is crazy because sooner or later you're going to have a problem. It's usually better to have tile or something. If you do have an event, it is critical to get that area dry, again, in that 24 to 48 hours to prevent that mold growth from being a problem. Vinyl wallpaper will hold moisture and condensation. And if you're thinking about doing, you know, some home renovating or taking the old wallpaper down, if you run into this type of situation, it's usually better to get a professional in because you're releasing a lot of spores into the environment, to your breathing area. We use infrared thermography inspections. That's where our name came from, CSI. And what this helps us do is identify the real problem, not the symptom. Again, the problem is water intrusion. If you can identify where the water's coming in and correct that, then you can deal with the mold and the mold won't come back. If you don't find what's causing the problem and you simply remediate the mold will be back and you'll have to do it all over again. And infrared cameras are a quick way to identify problems without tearing out things as well. And these are just some examples. And this was a roof area that had no attic. And they thought the skylight was leaking, but there was no signs around. The leak problem actually showed up several feet away, and it turned out it was a skylight, and these pictures prove that. This home inspection was done the day before. The ceiling looks fine. On the right-hand side and the left-hand side, you can clearly see that the toilet seal, the bathroom above, was leaking, and this particular buyer was a pediatrician and was deathly afraid of mold. So, you know, if that had not been found, he might have a mold problem there in a short period of time and be very upset with the purchase of the home and the sellers and his home inspector. So now we've got, you know, those areas where we're using infrared to detect the presence. We're looking in the critical areas. We find some, you know, some type of growth, and we got to determine whether or not there's a potential mold problem there. Maybe there's musty odors. So what we do is there's a different way to test. You can swab test, like in the bottom left-hand picture there. And that swab is sent to a certified lab, and that identifies the type of mold, whether it's toxic or not. That will not identify what is in the air or what level you might be breathing, but it will tell you whether it's a toxic mold. The next thing to do is the tape test. I do a lot more swab tests. For me, somehow the tape and the glove theory never seems to work too well. And you can also take bulk samples of carpet or sheetrock where you've had mold growth and send them to the lab as well. If you feel that you have a problem, you don't see anything, or you want to know the level of exposure that is potentially there from hidden mold growth, air test. You take a sample indoors, and then you take a sample outdoors. It's a negative sample. Threshold level, like with radon, where you have 4 picocuries per liter. In mold, it varies simply because the area of the country might be different. For instance, if you're in Arizona, they send you there because there's very little moisture in the air, very few mold spores, good for your sinuses and breathing. If you're in the Everglades, the mold spores outdoors may be a lot higher. So you take a sample indoors, and you take a sample outdoors, you send it to an accredited lab, and then they do this report. They compare those two samples, and the report will either come back elevated, which means you have an elevated spore condition, mold condition inside the home. That simply means that the mold count of spores per cubic meter is a lot higher inside than it is outside. And that's an indication typically that there's something inside the home and growing and releasing mold spores into the environment and making the inside environment, again, because we build them airtight now, a hazard to be in. And that elevated level indicates there's probably something going on inside that needs to be corrected. If it comes back not elevated, that tells you that the spores are normal count, because remember, their spores are in every room except for some hospital clean rooms. And then there's no further action necessary. So the air test will, eliminate the potential. It'll also tell you the type of mold, whether or not it's a hazardous mold. So do-it-yourself kits, we're not big fans of them. Basically, what you do, make a dish. You can get them at the box stores, Home Depot, Lowe's. They give you a little solution. You take the cover off that Petri dish. It has an agar food source in it. You put the solution in there, which is the moisture. Any mold spores that are floating in the air settle in that environment, and those home tests will always grow mold because there's always mold spores in the air. Now, they are somewhat beneficial to identifying the type of mold, but they won't tell you whether or not it's an elevated or normal condition, and where the mold's coming from, or the moisture, which is really causing the mold problem. So, who remediates? And this is kind of surprising. If you go to EPA.gov and put /mold, EPA.gov/mold guide, it will tell you that typically, and again, usually this is more a non-real estate transaction because the addendum is usually required if it's found at the point of the home inspection. If it's found prior to that, if it's less than 10 square feet, a homeowner can remediate the mold themselves, and the EPA will actually give you some guidelines. There are some safety issues, such as getting an N95 mask. You get those at Home Depot. An N95 mask is simply a mask that filters the micron level down small enough to prevent you from breathing mold spores, so it's not a health issue. If it's above 10 feet and there's a lot of water damage, then you want to probably hire a professional to remediate. And if it's over 100 square feet, then you should have containment of that remediation process. So let's talk a little bit more about that process and what should transpire. First, you have an assessment where you should have a mold professional come in, test, look at the situation, determine what type of mold is present, what needs to be done to eliminate it, and basically he writes a protocol, which is what we do on a regular basis. And that protocol will tell the remediation company what steps need to be taken in order to eliminate the problem. Part of that assessment for us always includes an infrared camera because that'll help us pick up hidden areas of moisture and where the moisture is actually penetrating to make sure that area gets corrected. Otherwise, the mold will regrow after you tear out the infested area. If it's a large area and you're tearing out that infested sheetrock or wallboard insulation, as you tear it out, you actually release more spores and mold into the environment and make it more hazardous to be in. So it's important that in large areas and problem areas that you establish a containment. And that containment includes a machine that will help clean the air. And in the process of removing the mold-infested items, then you can come back in and do a post-test to make sure you solve the problem. So that mold assessment is, again, to determine the source of the problem, create a plan for correcting the water event, dry any or clean any non-moldy materials to prevent mold growth on those wet items, make all the occupants aware, set up HEPA filtration systems and air scrubbers to clean the air, maybe permanently install a dehumidifier if humidity is the cause of the problem, and then do a post-test typically within 24 hours of remediation to make sure that whatever mold remediation process that has taken place has solved the problem. And here's some pictures of that in the upper left, and some of those machines in there are air scrubbers. that basically are vented outside through this tubing, and that creates a negative air pressure similar to the exhaust over your kitchen that takes that air outside, and the negative pressure prevents any spores in that containment area from being spread through the house. And they're cleaned through a HEPA filtration unit and ducted outside so they're not spread through the house. And those are some typical pictures of entry doors for containment areas. The people themselves should wear personal protective equipment. The product should be labeled and cleaned appropriately, any contaminated areas. And again, post-test, do the same air test within 24 hours to get a mold-free certificate that says the condition's not elevated, and to make sure that you've solved the original problem. So here's some pictures, give you some ideas. The guys in the hazmat suits. Upper right, we kind of use a little different than this. We use a full face mask, but it has a pump under positive pressure that actually forces filtered air into instead of breathing through a respirator, that keeps air from leaking in the sides, a little more effective. And you can see these people are, most of them here, here's the tear out to the upper left. And in the bottom right, those people are applying the treatment after the tear out's been completed. So when you deal with mold in a real estate transaction, you know, a lot of people, once mold is found in a house, it's critical that whoever discovers that mold, if it's a home inspector, it's really advantageous for him to be a mold professional.
Give us a second, everyone. Barry just disappeared, but he'll be back on in just a moment. So just give us 1 minute and we'll get this fixed. Okay, so I'm not sure where Barry went to, but I'm sure when he's able to come back on, he'll be with us. He's on, we just can't hear him. All right. So, at least we were at the end of our presentation today. So obviously, mold is correctable, should not be considered a deal breaker. In my book, I say get rid of all the mold. I can't deal with it. Barry, are you on? All right. So here are some helpful websites and phone numbers for everybody. Of course, you can contact Barry at csiofvirginia.com and his phone number, and he'll be more than happy to direct you to resources and to what you need to know. And then you have the Indoor Air Quality Association, who has a list of everybody who is certified to remediate and or test for molds. And of course, the U.S. EPA site, excellent for any environmental condition you might want. It's just epa.gov/mold or /lead or whatever that the topic is that you need more information on. And of course, the American Red Cross, repairing your flooded home. This is an excellent piece of advice. to be able to pass out to your clients whenever you need to, or for yourself, of course. So I want to say thank you so much for your attention today. And please keep in mind, we have another webinar this evening with Cindy Bishop on how to set your goals for 2015. We have a excellent Facebook radio show on Tuesday next week at noon, and another webinar coming up also on that. So, oh, there you are. Hey, Barry.
Yeah. I don't know what happened, but I'm back. Did you have any questions that we needed to answer?
No, I don't see any questions. Does anybody have a question? You can put it in the chat box. Nope, nothing's coming up right now. So I want to say thank you, Barry, for coming today and giving us this great information. And yes, I have the heebie-jeebies because mold and I are not friends.
You've got the helpful websites there for you, the Indoor Air Quality Association. That's actually IAQA.org. And then your EPA /mold or mold guide. And if you need some information about flooding or how to clean up your home, the American Red Cross has a good website link there as well.
Excellent. Hey, I had 2 questions just came in. So Karen wants to know if a mold test has been done, does it need to be disclosed?
That would depend. I mean, there's a lot of situations like in Virginia, we have what is called caveat emptor, the buyer beware. Usually it's a good idea that if you've had a mold problem and you've cleaned it up and you got a positive test, that you make them aware, because sometimes in the process, depending on where you live, you always have those nosy neighbors that might realize that there was a mold problem there and might be willing to share that information with any potential buyer. So it's probably not a bad idea. You'd probably, depending on the circumstance, might be wise to get some advice from a professional on that individual situation.
Okay, excellent. And then a question, can you repeat what can be done with the kit from the Home Depot?
All it's really going to do is tell you the type of mold. It's not going to tell you the level of exposure when you're breathing the air. And it will give you what I kind of like to call a false positive. Remember, there's mold spores in the air all the time. So if a mold spore lands in that Petri dish for that home test, it's going to grow. And I get all the time where tenants have gotten that home test, and when I get there, they have this sample of this growth that, mold never looks pretty when it's growing. So they're all freaked out by it. And of course, we do an air test, visual signs, we infrared, no moisture problems, no signs of mold growth. The air test comes back clean. And maybe they had the flu or something, got sick, and, mold gets blamed quickly. And then they go out and get the home test and find out that the mold spore landed and it grew. But, there's mold spores in the air everywhere. So it kind of gives them a false positive. So I'm not a big fan of the home test for that reason.
Okay, excellent. And I think we have one last question. I know that there's some special paints you can use in the outdoors to kill mold. How about any special paint you can use in the house to cover over mold and keep it from growing?
Well, you hear a lot of products. Kills is one of them that's real popular, and there's a lot of sealants out there that help prevent mold growth. If you're doing a bathroom, there's different types of sheetrock and moisture areas that'll help prevent mold growth. The danger with some of those products is that some people think they're curatives. And if you apply something that's going to seal the wood and that wood's still wet, then you're not solving the problem. If the wood is dry and you're doing it as a preventive, then yeah, there's a lot there. What they do is they seal the outside of the wood that helps prevent the mold spore from germinating pores of the wood. Advantage of it. If you got mold or hypha already in the wood and the wood is wet, put that sealant in the mold in, you're not really solving the problem. Does that help?
Sorry. Hey, I made myself silent. So, what about sheetrock that's been treated to prevent mold? Is that something that you would recommend for remodeling an area that's had mold problems?
Yeah, there's we call it commonly green board. There's sheetrock that's preferred to be used in moisture areas, and that'll help prevent mold growth. Sometimes people will use standard sheetrock and put a bathroom in those areas and end up with a mold problem because that regular sheetrock is so porous that it really grows mold.
Okay, wonderful. And Barbara has a question of when bathroom tiles are dry and a sealant is applied, will it solve the problem?
Yeah, usually the problem, we get a lot of mold in bathroom areas around grout and stuff, and the grout becomes porous. And the best thing to do typically is regrout those areas because you find if you bleach them or clean them, the mold grows back. And the reason for that is the hypha, or the roots of the mold, have gotten into that porous grout and allowed that to grow. If you can get the area dry and regrouted, anything that you do to seal that area will help prevent future mold growth once you solve the current mold growth problem.
Yeah, and let me just add on there as somebody who has taken out many a bathroom. I used to do remodeling with my dad, and you can have no sign of mold on the front, on the tile or around the bathroom. But if there's a leak, once you take that tile down, you'll find it's in the wood, or or on the sheetrock back behind it where it's not obvious. So once it's in the wood, it can crawl throughout that airspace in that wall. So you might want to be aware of that. And Ben had a question. Sorry, what did you say, Barry?
That's what freaked you out about mold. You used to have to tear out the bathrooms with your dad.
Well, that and I'm a biologist, so I had to take microbiology a number of times. So,
so musty smell, no question.
Yes.
Okay. Usually, if you've got that musty smell, there is some hidden mold growth somewhere. The first thing I'd recommend is for you to get, and you can get them pretty cheaply but they don't register rapidly. You get those weather things that you sit in one place that'll give you the barometric pressure, the humidity, and the temperature. You can buy them at box stores, sit them on a dining room table, sit them in some place where you have that musty odor. And what you might find is that you've got an elevated humidity condition, which means that humidity may be causing condensation behind the walls in a hidden area, and mold's growing back there, but it's not visibly showing up in the structure. Or you may have some water penetration or condensation around pipes that are causing mold to grow in a hidden area. Sometimes an infrared camera will pick up the moisture. The unit I use actually picks up humidity in a wall, and that will help. But typically, if you got a musty smell, those are mold spores that are growing. They might be growing on anything from clothes to shoes to structural items or to in the area behind the walls, like the bathroom example Ashley just gave.
Okay, so we have time for any other questions you may have. Okay, excellent. Well, if everybody's ready and no more questions, of course, you can always call Barry and you can always email him at barry@csiofvirginia.com, or just look up their website to contact them. And Barry, thank you so much. This was, as always, a very fascinating and entertaining presentation, even if I do have the heebie-jeebies and just want to go take a shower right now. Oh, Barry, what's your surname? Robinson. I know that because I see it all the time, but all of a sudden my brain went blank.
No problem.
Yeah, I have that problem when I get under pressure. Oh no, I have to think. Anyway, so thank you everyone for your time today. You can always contact Barry. You can always contact myself, Ashley Ross, at the Coaching Chicks, and we are so pleased to host these learning events for you. Have a great day, everyone.